Every afternoon at precisely 3:15, people in the park would glance toward the old iron bench beneath the maple tree, where an aging man with sunken cheeks and thick military boots sat in absolute stillness, one trembling hand hovering above a small wooden chessboard, balanced perfectly on the table between him and a boy who couldn't have been older than 12, and the pieces, slightly worn from decades of play, seemed to hold the history of hundreds of games between them. This man, a decorated war veteran known by a few locals only as Colonel, had made this routine his anchor, bringing his grandson along almost every day unless the weather intervened. And it had gone on like this for years, quiet and unnoticed by most. Just another scene in the backdrop of a city that didn't care much for old soldiers. Until one Tuesday in early autumn, when the air had a thin sharpness to it. The veteran hesitated before sitting down, winced as he lowered himself, and then paused with his hand pressed against his chest, his jaw tightening just for a moment before he forced a smile at the boy and set up the board as usual, though he moved slower that day, coughed more, and rubbed his hands like they were too cold for September. And the next day he wasn't there, nor the next. And on the third day, the boy came alone, carrying the board awkwardly under one arm, sitting down in silence, and waiting for longer than usual before lining up the pieces by himself. But the seat opposite him remained empty for a week, until word slowly passed through the nearby cafe staff and joggers and passers-by that the colonel had been taken to the hospital after collapsing in his kitchen and lying on the floor for several hours before a neighbor checked in, and the boy kept returning to the bench, setting up the board, and staring at the pieces without moving them, not even when a light drizzle fell or the wind blew away the pawns. Because in his mind, he wasn't alone. He was still playing the game they hadn't finished, the one where the colonel had said, "I won't go easy on you today." And even though no one said it out loud, people started watching him from a distance, feeling like something had shifted in the rhythm of the park itself. And every day the silence around that bench grew heavier, as if holding its breath, waiting for something that hadn't yet happened but somehow would. And you could feel it in the way the boy tightened his grip on the bishop when the wind picked up, or how his eyes darted to the tree line, like he expected someone to emerge. And all of this, every quiet moment, every invisible thread of tension, was leading to something bigger, though no one yet knew what. And it's only when you look back that you realize the real story hadn't even begun yet. And all of this was just the moment before the board changed forever. It wasn't sudden, but that didn't make it easier. When the veteran finally passed, the hospital didn't announce it, the newspapers didn't print it, and the world didn't stop. But in the quiet corners where he'd once sat, something had changed. The boy's mother got the call in the middle of the night and whispered the news to her son before school, and he didn't say anything, just nodded once and turned his face toward the wall as if memorizing how it looked before everything felt different. They held a military procession for him the following Saturday, with polished boots, solemn salutes, and the deep silence of respect that echoed louder than any speech. And the boy wore the dark coat his grandfather had given him 2 winters ago and held a folded flag in arms. Too small for the weight it carried, and when the last note of the trumpet faded, no one knew where the boy went. But if you'd been watching the park that next Monday, you'd have seen him there again, dragging the same chessboard with the same worn pieces, placing it on the bench like he was setting a table for someone who was just late, not gone. He set up the pieces slowly, hesitated before moving the first pawn, and then played both sides, switching seats after each move, whispering the lines his grandfather would have said. Little jabs, little lessons. And though his mouth trembled, he kept going, and he kept returning, day after day, even when the cold numbed his fingers, because something about that unfinished game pulled at him like a thread he couldn't cut. People passed by and noticed, some with puzzled looks, others with quiet nods, but no one interrupted until one Thursday near dusk, a tall man with a limp and a long coat paused near the bench, watching the boy move a knight into a trap and mutter a correction aloud like he knew his grandfather would have caught it. And something about that scene made the man's chest tighten, because he had known the old colonel years ago, had served with him once in a place no one liked to name, and he remembered hearing stories about the park and the chess games, though he'd never seen them for himself until now. And for a long moment he stood there, the collar of his coat pulled up, eyes hidden beneath his cap, unsure whether to say something or keep walking. But then the boy looked up, just for a second, and there was something raw in his face, something so unguarded that it stopped the man in place. And without a word, he stepped closer, his boots crunching softly on the gravel, and waited for the boy to make the next move, not on the board, but in the silence between them. And when none came, he spoke gently, asking if he could sit down, maybe just watch. And the boy nodded, barely, not trusting his voice. And then after a pause, the man pointed at the board and said, "You forgot your bishop," and slid it one square forward, where the old man would have moved it. And the boy blinked fast, lips parting like he was about to protest. But then closing again, and for the first time in weeks, he wasn't playing alone. The game was slower now, with long pauses between moves, and neither spoke much, but the man came back the next day and the next, and over time, the rhythm returned. Not the same rhythm, but something close enough to comfort, and even the cafe staff noticed and started bringing over a thermos of tea they used to give the colonel, as if by habit. And strangers began pausing a few steps away, pretending to check their phones while watching the moves unfold, as if trying to understand what made that game so important. And maybe they sensed it wasn't about the game at all, not really, but something deeper. A quiet continuation, a tether to something lost, but not gone. The boy never asked the man much, and the man never offered more than needed, though sometimes he told small stories, not the kind with explosions or medals, but about shared cans of beans or long nights on watch. And those stories stayed with the boy in ways he didn't fully understand, reshaping the silence his grandfather left behind into something that breathed differently. Winter crept in slowly, frost edging the table, and still they came. Layers thicker, hands stiffer, but the board remained between them like a contract signed without words. And one day, just before Christmas, the man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a piece the colonel had once lost, a black rook with a chipped corner, and handed it to the boy like a passing torch, saying only, "He told me you'd be better than him someday." And the boy held it for a long time before nodding, not trusting himself to speak. And though nothing was said aloud, they both knew that something big had begun. Not in a way anyone else would notice, not in headlines or ceremonies, but in the quiet return of something human, something quietly defiant against the slow forgetting of time. And if you keep watching, just wait, because the real story, the one no one expects, is still coming. And when it arrives, it won't be loud or dramatic, but it will stay with you, like the weight of a hand on your shoulder when you need it most. The boy hadn't expected to win, not really. Not against someone who moved like he remembered the board better than the street they were sitting on. But move by move, with quiet concentration and a hand that trembled less than it had in weeks, he pushed the black king into the final corner and set down his queen with finality. And the veteran stared at the board for a long time, before giving the softest nod, like acknowledging not just defeat but something else entirely. And that's when the boy's shoulders started shaking, and he pressed his hands against his face, as if trying to stop the emotion from spilling out. But it was no use. He cried not just because he'd won, but because for a moment he'd felt that same flicker of presence he used to feel every day when his grandfather sat across from him, narrowing his eyes and mumbling about rook traps and early castling. And now the space across the table wasn't empty anymore, but full of someone who, somehow, understood. The veteran didn't say anything right away, just waited, letting the boy breathe, and then quietly reached out and adjusted a piece that had fallen slightly out of place, as if tidying up not just the board, but the moment itself. And when the boy finally looked up, eyes still red and wide, the man said he'd be happy to play again sometime, only if the boy wanted. And without a second thought, the boy nodded, and just like that, something shifted in both of them. Not dramatically, not with any great declaration, but in the way people do when pain meets understanding in silence. So they kept meeting. Not every day, but often enough. And with each game, the conversation between them expanded. Small comments about school or weather, or the way some people never learn not to open with the queen too early. And the boy started talking more, asking questions about the war, not the kind with battles or medals, but the quieter things, the waiting, the loneliness, the boredom. And the veteran answered only what he thought the boy could carry, painting his stories in understatement and dry humor. And the boy listened with an attentiveness far beyond his years, like each word was a move on the board they hadn't yet seen play out. Slowly, habits formed. Same time, same bench, same thermos of tea. The cafe girl started bringing without being asked, and though neither of them said it, it became clear to everyone who noticed that the boy wasn't alone anymore, and the man, who hadn't shared a bench with anyone in years, had found in the boy a kind of quiet presence that made the days feel less heavy. The chess games themselves became more than just games, sometimes long and thoughtful, other times short and messy, interrupted by laughter or sudden stories, and they began to speak in shorthand, in half sentences and eye rolls, and knowing glances that only people who play the same game long enough can share. Seasons changed, and the maple tree lost its leaves, then grew them back, and still they met, changing little but becoming more familiar with each visit, until the sight of them at that bench no longer drew looks but nods of recognition, like a fixture that made the park feel more whole. The boy brought friends once or twice, and they watched awkwardly, unsure how to engage. But the veteran let them play too, giving them the same gentle corrections, the same sly challenges he'd given the boy's grandfather decades before, and the boy noticed the way he watched them, not judging but remembering. And in time, he realized something deeper had happened. The veteran hadn't just replaced his grandfather, he'd become something unique, connected to the old man by memory and respect, but shaped by his own voice, his own rhythm, his own way of waiting before moving a pawn forward with that same deliberate care. They never said it out loud, never tried to define what they'd built, but every game etched it a little deeper into reality. Something unspoken and strong, like the groove of a well-used board, imperfect but lasting. The boy began to leave his phone in his pocket more often, to ask questions about life that didn't come from textbooks, and the veteran, though rarely giving full answers, always gave enough to make the boy think, enough to make him look out across the park differently, as if there were more stories hidden in the grass and gravel than he'd ever realized. Eventually, others started to join. An old man who used to teach math, a woman who had once beaten her brother in nationals, a teenager who'd only played online but wanted to try it for real. And slowly the bench became a small circle, still centered around the boy and the veteran, but widened just enough to let others in, and each time, each game, the boy seemed to grow a little, not taller, but steadier, more certain, as if the weight of that first folded flag had become something he could now carry differently, no longer alone. And though the veteran said less and less as time passed, his presence never diminished. In fact, it deepened in the way people sometimes do when they've stopped needing to prove anything. And the boy watched him closely, noticing more, the way he lined up his pieces with exact symmetry, the pause he took before sitting down, the way he folded the corners of his coat under him like a ritual. And all of it added layers to the quiet bond between them, one not made from blood or names, but built move by move, year by year, as steady and deliberate as the games they never stopped playing. And if you passed by today and looked closely, you might see them there, side by side, bent over the board, in a silence that says more than words ever could. And if you watched long enough, you'd realize this story isn't over yet, not even close. And the final move hasn't been played, because some games don't end. They just keep evolving. And sometimes the most important victories are the ones that don't feel like wins at all, but simply the quiet continuation of something once thought lost, now found again in the rhythm of a hand reaching for a pawn.